Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Frank Kessel. I'm a member of the leadership team, a senior fellow and member of the leadership team of the Health Policy Center. And I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of Gabe Sanchez, our acting director, and everybody else associated with the center, staff, other faculty, and especially students who you should know are very much involved in planning the speaker series. So I want to welcome you to this, the second of our series and spring series. And I especially want to say how pleased we are because, not only because you're all here, but sort of as a byproduct, I think, of the fact that this particular speakers event is largely due to the efforts, the initiative of Kristen Barker and other people in sociology. I'll simply say that the center has always attempted, sometimes more and sometimes less successfully, to build collaborative relationships with other places, spaces, and people on campus. And this is by far the best example of that kind of collaboration. So I'm especially thankful to Kristen, and we are especially thankful to Kristen and the sociology department. And I am therefore pleased to have Kristen introduce our guest speaker.
Hi, welcome everybody, and thanks to everybody who's participated in putting this together, especially Estella, I couldn't have done it without you, so thank you so much, Estella. It's a really great honor to me personally to introduce Professor Peter Conrad. I'll just give you a few of the formal things about Peter, and then I want to share a little personal detail. Professor Conrad is the Harry Coplin Professor of Social Sciences at Brandeis University. He received his PhD in sociology at Boston University, and he's been at Brandeis since 1979. He served as chair of the Sociology Department for nearly a decade, and he is currently the chair of the interdisciplinary program Health, Science, Society, and Policy, which he tells me is the fastest growing major at Brandeis. He's the author of over 100 articles and chapters and 10 books. In simple terms, Professor Conrad is a legend. A long, long time ago, when I was an undergraduate, I read a lot of books, but two of them really shaped my life. I was a sophomore business major with aspirations to write commercial jingles for television when I somehow wandered into a Sociology of Deviance class and read dramatically. And I read the book, The Medicalization of Deviance by Peter Conrad and Joseph Snyder, which provides a detailed account of how people who in our society who at one time were considered bad, or as my mother would say, naughty, came to be defined as ill. So how the drunk became an alcoholic, how the mad became mentally ill, how unruly children came to have attention deficit disorder. The book also explains what the reasons behind this transformation are and some of the important consequences of it are. I immediately changed my major, became a sociology major, took another class where I read the book, The Sociology of Health and Illness, which is an edited volume that is was first put together by Professor Conrad in 1981. Last year, the 9th edition of the book was published. And in that, every edition has contained the seminal readings that really define the field of medical sociology. And he's been doing that, defining the parameters of medical sociology for more than 30 years. So I said I became a major. I then became a medical sociologist. I'm not only the beneficiary of his academic scholarship, but I am the beneficiary, like many others in medical sociology, of his mentorship. The graduate students and undergraduate students, even in this room, should not miss the opportunity to talk to Peter while he's here. There are few people in the field of medical sociology who know more about the discipline, and none who will be as generous. So please, we have some events scheduled. Take advantage of them. We're going to go for a walk in the desert somewhere, which sounds treacherous, on Saturday, and you can join us if you'd like. He's been awarded countlessly for all of his work, including the most prestigious award in medical sociology for the Leo Reader Award for major contributions to the subfield. Today, Professor Conrad is going to be talking to us about a book he published in 2007 with the Johns Hopkins University Press, The Medicalization of Society, on the transformation of human conditions into treatable disorders. A review of this book, which appeared in the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine, demonstrates the importance of his scholarship well beyond the confines of medical sociology, and I'll just quote briefly from that review. Recommended reading for practicing physicians, or better yet, for all physicians in training. The so-called gatekeepers need to be reminded that reductionist medical perspectives are problematic and that the best solutions account for the social complexity that is inherent in the human condition. Please join me in welcoming Professor Peter Conrad.
That's okay. I'm just trying to figure out how to get this thing to work. Ah, there we go. There I am. Now it's familiar territory. Indeed. I'm glad to be here. It's really nice to see people that are interested. It's also really nice to be in New Mexico after the Boston winter. There's still snow on my property. Snow, you know, that's that white stuff that comes down. And I've been to Albuquerque only once before, and I really liked it when I was here. My wife and I both like the desert a lot, and I look forward to actually hiking and doing all of that. But it's even more fun to come talk about things that I think are important. I just, to the graduate students, I want to just say one word about this era. I'm probably have written more about ADHD and medicalization than I've written about other things, especially about medicalization. When I was writing my dissertation, which was about ADHD, then called hyperactive children, when I wrote my dissertation proposal, it had the really, really boring title of Factors in the Identification of Hyperactive Children. This was 1974, or 73, when I wrote my dissertation proposal. It didn't mention the word medicalization anywhere. In fact, I'd never heard of it. And then I went out and started collecting data, and I started to see, I was doing research in a major pediatric hospital. I was interviewing a lot of parents, mostly mothers, about their children. And at that time, I could actually look at school records and school referrals, actually, to the program. You couldn't do that now. To see why people thought that these kids needed to come here for the behavior problems that weren't obviously medical problems, or at least weren't medical problems in the traditional way this major pediatric hospital dealt with medical problems. That being said, it was only halfway through writing my dissertation that I read an article by Irving Zola called Medicine as an Institution of Social Control, and learned about this term that he used there, and not a lot of people had talked about, called medicalization. I said, oh my God, that's what I'm studying. And that's what I've been studying for the past 35 years. So it's just interesting when you start and I've done other things in between also, but on and off for 35 years. But what's really interesting is you don't know what's going to hit you in the face. And I look at what I proposed in 1973, 74, and I should have figured this out. I should have known, but I didn't. And it was only this reading this, and it sort of changed my life, my professional life. So I'm going to share some of that with you now. So when we talk about medicalization, let's all get on the same page. It really is simple. It means to make medical. I used to have to explain to people what it is. You don't have to explain to people anymore. Everybody sort of gets it now because when I started studying it, it was on the edge of sociology, on the edge of the world. People didn't necessarily think about that. Now you talk about medicalization. Some people still say, well, what does that mean? You explain to them it means to make medical of some things that weren't medical, and you give them a few examples. They all get it now. And if you want a more technical definition, I put that up here too. Medicalization is the process by which non-medical problems become treated as medical problems, defined and treated as medical problems, usually in terms of illness or disorders. People, when they talk about medicalization, think you're always talking about over-medicalization, but that's not the case. We can talk about, there can be arguments made for some things that may be over-medicalized in one population, ADHD, for instance, the suburban middle-class populations, and under-medicalized in other populations, or at least if you believe that the category is viable. So medicalization, when people talk about it, they almost use it as an epithet sometimes, like it's a bad thing. But sociologists, you all need to understand that we study zations. Industrialization, secularization, urbanization, medicalization. it's not necessarily a good or bad thing. When we study urbanization, we don't necessarily say, oh, let's get rid of cities. And close them up, everybody back to the countryside. They tried that. That doesn't work. So I think it's really important to recognize that when we talk about medicalization, we're not necessarily talking about over-medicalization and not necessarily talking about that this is good or bad. I'm going to emphasize in my talk today what I think are some of the difficulties about medicalization, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's the only thing that we're going to. And in fact, I have a part in here, if I have time, I'll talk about what I think has been a beneficial aspects of medicalization, some very specific things. So, and the other thing is that medicalization isn't necessarily good or bad. Medicalization is, and as we as sociologists need to study what medicalization is and what its consequences are without making the moral judgments of this is good or bad, or the moral judgments of this is really an illness, this is really a disease. We're sociologists, we know this. You're doctors, you're really stupid. You don't know that this isn't really a disease, it's only a social construction. You don't have to get there. You don't have to go there. The place you need to go is to say, I want to understand how people decide that this condition, this set of behaviors, is something that's a medical diagnosis, and how they believe it or justify it, and what the consequences are. You don't have to say that this really exists or doesn't exist, because in fact you get into territory. So I stay agnostic on those things, and I'm really agnostic. If you ask me later about what I really think about ADHD, I'll give you my opinion, but my opinion is different than my analysis. Okay, so medicalization is growing and expanding. When I first started writing about it in the early 70s, these were the conditions that were medicalized. Some of them are familiar to you, some of them are not. But these were medicalized. You can make arguments about what the date was and so forth. Since 1970s, you can see there's about 4 times as many, and I'm only putting up the categories that are common. I mean, things like, when I first started teaching medical sociology in the 1970s, we didn't know what the word anorexia meant. Obesity was not seen as a medical problem. PTSD was unknown. Erectile dysfunction, that was called something else, and it wasn't a common medicalized, it was called impotence. What an awful word, isn't it? Impotence, no power. Fetal alcohol syndrome, sleep, which is, I have a student writing a dissertation on medicalization of sleep, on sleep apnea. Fascinating, but it was not a medical problem. Sleep was what you did or didn't do. What you avoided or what you aimed for, but it wasn't considered a medical problem. I mean, there were sleeping pills always, just like there were pills for other things, but that didn't necessarily make them medicalized in the same way. And on, I won't go. So let me talk about the characteristics of medicalization. As I already started to say, that the key to medicalization is a definitional issue, how the problem becomes defined and what is the consequence. So the definition is the issue. You don't have to have, as I'll say this a couple of times, physicians necessarily very involved. One of the most long-term medicalized forms of deviant behavior has been alcoholism. And the alcoholism was defined not because physicians wanted to medicalize it, but because Alcoholics Anonymous did. And although they had a very esoteric view of medicalization, they were a social movement that basically medicalized alcoholism. And the key was the definition of it, and not necessarily physician involvement. There are degrees of medicalization. We have some forms of conditions or behaviors that are fully medicalized. In our society, despite reforms in the last 30 years or 20 years, childbirth is largely medicalized in our society. And we can think about schizophrenia is largely medicalized in our society. Whether or not people get good treatment for it or not is a separate issue, but nobody's going to say, oh, schizophrenia, that's a lifestyle. No. And then there are things that are hardly medicalized in our society. Internet addiction, or what was the other one I was thinking of? Internet addiction. Gambling addiction, sort of in the middle, is somewhat medicalized. And then there's things where there are different kinds of views on it. Opiate addiction, There are people in our society who treat opiate addiction, treat it as an addiction, treat all addictions as a sickness. Oh, I know the non-medicalized shopping addiction. Shopping addiction would be another one, like internet addiction. That is somewhat medicalized, but it's not really medicalized. I think if you put you went to your doctor and said, oh, I'm not feeling very well. What's the matter? I have shopping addiction. Well, I'm sorry, I don't diagnose that. Then you leave and say, she has doctor shopping addiction. There's a name for that, actually, too. But anyway, the point is there are degrees of medicalization. And to say that something's medicalized, it's not like a toggle switch. Some things are more medicalized than others. Some things are contested, as I was just beginning to say about opiate addiction. I mean, people who have opiate addiction can get medical treatment. Other people have opiate addiction, end up in jail. And what the difference is probably sociologists can tell us very well about that. Categories can also expand and contract. I'll just name two of my favorite examples of that. As I mentioned to you earlier, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, was not a very well-known disorder in the 1970s. But when we began to have soldiers come back from the Vietnam War who had flashbacks and who had headaches and were somewhat depressed and had night sweats, and mainly the flashbacks, they became this claim of a new disorder called post-traumatic stress disorder, very similar to what shell shock had been earlier. But it came with the Vietnam vets. If you jump to the 2013, now we have PTSD for people who have suffered child abuse or sexual abuse or violence in a relationship, or people who have viewed violence, or people who have been part of some kind of natural calamity like Katrina or something like that, or people who have just even been experienced, lost family or something in some situation like that. We've just expanded, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, it just is, that we've just expanded what we call PTSD. I will say a few caveats here. I'm married to a physician. My wife was an emergency physician for 20 years, and we've had discussions with PTSD. She said, I don't know what it is or whether it's really valid. I just know it's very useful for me to know about it because it tells me what to do as a physician. And that's an interesting way of looking at it. It still begs the sociological question of how did it get to where it got to and what are its consequences. The second example of expanding ADHD, expanding categories is ADHD, which I've actually done research on. In the 1970s, ADHD was talked about 250,000 to 500,000 kids, 6 to 12, who had this disorder. And half the kids outgrew it by the time they were 12, at least that's what people would say, and the other half had other difficulties. But mostly the focus was there. Now we talk about ADHD. There's adult ADHD. Just read CDC says there's 4 million adults with ADHD, or they call it adult ADHD. When now and it is redefined ADHD as a lifetime disorder. It's not something you sort of outgrow. And the difference between ADHD also in the 70s, was that it was 9 to 1 boys because people focused on the hyperactivity part. But eventually, when they changed the definition to focus on attention as opposed to behavior, suddenly they looked at the girls sitting in the back of the room, the ones who were spacing out, looking like that, and said, "Oh, they have ADHD too. They just don't have the hyperactivity part. They have the space out part." And since the word space out didn't go very well in the DSM, they just no. But it's an example of both of those are examples of categories that became established in one way and have grown in other ways. So when you talk about increasing medicalization, I talk about the increasing categories, which you just saw, but you also have to talk about the expansion of categories, how categories that were narrowly defined at one time became more broadly defined to include many more people. And as I think about the DSM, sort of slice and dice the diagnosis further. And they can also contract. How many people get it, for instance, how many people do you think today get a diagnosis of hysteria? Very few. Although hysteria was the most common diagnosis in women, certainly psychiatric diagnosis, well into the 1920s. And it's a long story, whatever happened to hysteria. It just got named other things. But still, I mean, the notion that the category itself contracted. And then I'll give you an example about categories that almost disappeared. And I already mentioned variable medical involvement, that there's a lot of some of the diagnoses. Well, I'll even go back half a step. People used to think that medicalization was medical imperialism, doctors trying to go out and capture the world and colonize all these. Not true. It's true in some cases. True in some cases. Most cases, when you look at them, are much more complicated than that. In fact, there were things like alcoholism that doctors wanted nothing to do with until the 1970s, and there became money available from NIAAA to do research on it. Because most doctors will tell you they don't know what to do for alcoholism. Even today, go to AA. It's good, you know. So there's variable doctor involvement. Sometimes you obviously see a lot of doctor involvement. Sometimes you see doctors with certain kind of entrepreneurs for certain kind of activity. A recent one is pediatric bipolar. There's some of you may know, there's a doctor named Biederman, who's a very well-known, I guess he's a neurologist or child psychiatrist, who has been promoting pediatric bipolar as a disorder to the point that there's now a 40 times higher rate of diagnosis of pediatric bipolar. And I don't want to go into the details of it, but sometimes there is a kind of doctor entrepreneurial case, but that tends to be a relatively rare case. They're mostly much more complicated. But my point here is that you don't need a lot of doctor involvement for certain kinds of medicalization. Medicalization is also bidirectional. It can go, things can become medicalized and they become demedicalized. And the two examples of demedicalization I'll mention briefly here, some of you may know these from others, but are masturbation and homosexuality. If you look in the medical literature, particularly between about 1870 and 1920, you'll see there was two diseases related to one another. We would call them both today masturbation. There was masturbatory insanity, and there was onanism. Onanism means, from the book of Onan in the Bible, spilling your seed and all of that. The notion was, and it was particularly true in Germany, actually, but it was true in the United States as well, there was a concern about boys, especially, who would masturbate, mostly at night, and there was a lot of concern about what they called nocturnal emissions, that the people had medical treatments for this. And the only reason I put this in my talk here is because it's interesting, and it's an interesting example. For example, they had treatments where they would tie a little string to a little boy's penis and put it up to a bell. So if he started touching himself in the middle of the night, ding, 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 Daddy could run in. Little Siegfried, what are you doing? But this, or putting a ring around a little boy's penis, that if you got an erection, a ring with little sharpie, edgy things, that if you got an erection, you'd know it, and maybe Daddy would know it too. These were in the medical textbooks. You can't make stuff like this up because, it's just beyond. And there are other examples of it, which I won't bother with. There were very few cases of female masturbation, but if they were much more seriously treated. The notion was that women didn't have much sexuality, and if they showed they had sexuality, they were either going to be fallen women or there's something seriously wrong with them. And in the extreme cases, they did clitorectomies on women in that same era. So you can see that we laugh at the kind of things they did to the boys, and nobody makes a sound with the things they did to some of the girls, although there were much, much fewer of those. So you can see today we don't think about masturbation, at least as an illness. When Freud came along, he basically said, well, masturbation's not so much of a disease, but if you're compulsive about it, it's probably a disease. Masters and Johnson, not Masters and Johnson, sorry, the Kinsey Report came in 1948 and 1953, male report and female report about American sexual practices, lots of problems with the methodology, but we'll leave those aside. And Kinsey reported that 93% of men had masturbated and 70% of women, my God. And suddenly it was kind of normal. And Masters and Johnson The Human Sexual Response wrote in 1979, or in the 1970s anyway, wrote about the human sexual response physiologically, and they wrote in their book, well, it's the people that don't masturbate we're concerned about, because they're repressed. So we had masturbation. I am certain it was the same thing in 1870, because there's only limited things you can do, to about 2010 or so. It's the same thing, but the definitions have changed. They've gone from medical definitions into non-medical definitions. So you don't necessarily see anybody being diagnosed in this way anymore. Homosexuality, you all know the story, and some of it gets repeated now that we have a Supreme Court case, just to show how far we've come. But masturbation was one example, but homosexuality is a more recent example. In the 1970s, and some of you are old enough to have been there, it was a time of change, time of social movements. It was the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, the women's movement, all sorts of different kinds of social movements. And there was, surprisingly to many of us at the time, a gay liberation movement that emerged. The gay liberation movement emerged in the late 1960s and began to bloom in the 1970s. And gay people in the United States felt oppressed. And they looked around for who their oppressor was. And one of the oppressors, they said, was psychiatry, because they think we're sick, because we're listed in the DSM as an illness, homosexuality as an illness. So they organized both inside and outside of psychiatry. They spent 3 years picketing various APA meetings. They organized research seminars about it, speeches, and really pushed psychiatrists to reconsider homosexuality as an illness. I'll leave the details out, but in 1973 they had a vote. Now I liked the apocryphal image. There was a big room, and you could vote directly. It's like, all of you who think homosexuality is an illness, raise your hands. All of you who think homosexuality is not an illness, raise your hands. Okay, we've just voted it out. Homosexuality is no longer in the DSM, and it's no longer an illness. That is true. That is exactly what happened. It happened by a mailed ballot. It didn't happen in person, but I like the image of having in person with all. So this is the democracy, a little democracy. But even with all the other things that have occurred in the past 35 years, some of which I've done research on and written about, things like the so-called gay gene and other, in a greater number of people, gay and lesbian men and women, who believe that whatever their sexual orientation is innate, is part of them, is part of their identity, part of who they are, as opposed to in the 70s, they told the psychiatrists, homosexuality is not an illness, it's a lifestyle. Who would use that term today? Nobody. So it's just interesting. They call it today maybe a sexual orientation or something, but they wouldn't call it a lifestyle. But anyway, these are the two major examples, and there are probably a few others that we can see about demedicalization. Compare that, though, to the list I showed you of medicalization earlier, and you'll see which way the wind is blowing. As Bob Dylan said, you don't have to be a weatherman to know which way the wind is blowing. All right, so engines of medicalization. What is causing all of this? I hesitate to use the word cause like that. I put it in quotes. But what are the factors? In the earlier days, I talked about the medical profession, interprofessional organizations, contests, and social movements. I'm going to skip talking about those because they're still important. And I've mentioned some of those already in terms of medical entrepreneurs and what have you, or different kind of conflicts, or AA as a social movement. And I'm going to move up to what I think has happened in the last 2 decades. In the last 2 decades, I think there are what I call the shifting engines of medicalization. We have biotechnology, especially the pharmaceutical industry, but in the future, genetics. Genetics I'll say a little bit about today, but your children and my children's children, if medicalization goes in the same direction it's been going for the past 30 or 40 years, a lot of the conflicts and issues will take place in genetics and neuroscience. But I'll get to that. Second is consumers. And when you talk about medicalization, talk about consumers, it's a whole different thing. It's a whole different thing. And, I'll give you an example. And I use the word managed care here. You could just fill in health insurance as instead of saying managed care. Physicians are still involved, but they're more subordinate in the process. They're largely gatekeepers in the expansion and contraction of medicalization. And we've had new kinds of categories medicalized that we wouldn't have even thought of. The largest and one of the most interesting, I won't say a whole lot about it, has been the medicalization of obesity. Whatever risk factors obesity creates, it's one thing, but to see obesity itself as a disease and be able to treat it is another. In fact, I used to say that one of the constraints on medicalization was that insurance companies wouldn't pay for gastric bypass operations. No longer true. They will, under certain conditions. So that shows once more how bad sociologists are at predictors. Oh, yeah, thank you. Someday they will come and they will bring me a special bottle of medicated water, just for this talk. We already have it all flavors. We can have it medicated as well. Why not? You're drinking it anyway. You may as well. Anyway. This is something I've done more recently with one of my graduate students and with a health policy guy at the Rand Corp, whatever it's called, at University of Pittsburgh. I've always wanted to know how much medicalization costs, how much it costs the healthcare system. I mean, that's not a way that most people look at it. It's not the way I look at it. But I was interested in it. And I'll spare you the details here. But we looked at 2005 when the GNP share of medical costs was 16%. And we looked at the direct costs, only the direct costs, not indirect costs, of 12 medicalized conditions using the 2005 MEPS data and other national data, and published it in 2010, Social Science and Medicine. And we came to the conclusion that about $77 billion is spent on medicalized kind. And this is not to say this is good or bad or anything, it's just how much it is. About 3.9% of total domestic spending on healthcare. Now, I can't figure out whether it's a lot or a little. It's as much money as we spend on public health. So think of that. Public health is everything. That means we don't spend very much on it. It's also about as much money as we spend on cancer. Cancer is a big disease. So it's not a small number, but it's not an overwhelming number. But I thought it was just interesting if we just take a cut of an angle like that. Anyway, I'm going to skip this. This is from the Deviance and Medicalization. All I wanted to say about a couple of things is that there are brighter and darker sides to medicalization of deviance. There were good reasons, possible benefits for somebody, either people who have the various conditions and disorders, and possible detriments for society or people who have the disorders. And I won't go into those. Most of those have been talked about, I'm sure, elsewhere. And so I'm going to talk about now what I think are some of the major discontents with medicalization. These, at least they're discontents that I have. When I say what are the consequences, these are some of the sociological consequences. My biggest concern about medicalization, if I have to have number one, if you take home one take-home message from me here today, is my concern is the pathologization of everything, turning all human difference into some kind of medical disorder, turning all difference into pathology. Some of you may have heard of this article I'm going to tell you about, The Last Well Person. The Last Well Person was published by written in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1994. You know, it's written in the New England Journal of Medicine. That's in a very special place. And by a guy named Meador, who is a physician himself. And it's a story, it's an allegory, and it goes something like this. A college professor in a small Midwestern, it turns out to be in Ohio, college, went to, 45 years old or something like that, went to his GP for a checkup. And the GP did one kind of test, cholesterol, Another kind of test, PSAs. Another kind of test, blood pressure. On and on, all these other kind of tests, blood work and all of this. And did a full kind of round and found nothing wrong with this patient. And this was the last well person. This was the last person in the United States without a diagnosis. Now, this was written as an allegory, of course, but it's an interesting notion because we have now created so many diagnoses, turned so many things into pathologies that we now have, my concern is the pathologization of everything. There's a guy in North Carolina named Norton Handler who's also written on this topic, and I think it's really interesting. And also, it's always raised in the back of my head is, whatever happened to hypochondria? Can somebody still be a hypochondriac? I mean, or will everybody actually get a diagnosis and you're not a hypochondriac anymore? It's an interesting paper for somebody to write. Whatever happened to hypochondria? My second issue, when I talk about what I think are some of the dilemmas about medicalization, is the increasing medical definitions of normality. The medical profession is increasingly defining, and this is true in medicine as well in psychiatry with the DSM. It's true in a number of different ways, is increasingly defining medical norms as social norms. And you can argue on individual cases whether it's a good thing or bad thing. I'll give you a couple of examples of that. And increasingly, we have the pharmaceutical industry now doing this. The pharmaceutical industry, but to promote its wares, has promoted what is conceived of as normal behavior. Let me give you just three quick examples. Unfortunately, I'm not always that quick, but three. Used to be quicker, but I don't take my pills anymore. No, not true, not true. I mean, not true that maybe true that I used to be quicker, but the pills is a joke. Aging and sexual performance. Those of you who are under the age of 25 here, let me tell you, there was a world before Viagra. People did have sex before Viagra. It's hard to believe, but they did. When Viagra first came out, I think it was 1998 or something like that. It wasn't that long ago. When Viagra first came out, it was introduced, in first place, I'll tell you first, best part of the story, this is what everybody will remember from this talk. Does anybody know how they discovered Viagra? How did they discover Viagra?
I think it was a heart medication.
And it was an antihypertensive medication, right? But how did they discover? Raise the diet. But how did they discover? The men were not. They had it out on trial. The men were not returning their extra pills. That's the truth. And drug companies, being smart as they are, said, why are these guys? Well, the kind of side effects I kind of like. I kind of think they're. And so the drug companies, they're anything but stupid, said there may be something here. And so what they did was, first place, they changed the definition, or at least were involved in changing the definition, from impotence to erectile dysfunction, or eventually sexual dysfunction. It was a much nicer term than impotence, and I totally agree with that. When they first presented the drug, they actually promoted it for people who had medical conditions like diabetes or prostate cancer or some kind of surgery that had physiologically based erectile dysfunction that they had now some kind of treatment for. But that didn't last long, because then they said, well, there's a lot of people who have this kind of trouble with erectile dysfunction, and we should help them too. And so they started with older people. Some of you remember Bob Dole. Bob Dole was a vice presidential candidate, and I believe later a presidential candidate, if I keep that straight. And he came on television, and he advertised. This is, when you want to get involved. He advertised Viagra, and that he took Viagra, and then they said, well, he represented the old people. Then there's another group of people that says, well, old people. We have other people who still have sexual dysfunction, and I'm sure that sexual dysfunction exists as long as people try to have sex, because it's just what happens sometimes. We have other people. Let's see if we can get the mostly men people they were talking about, obviously. And then they had Rafael Palmeiro. Some of you know Rafael Palmeiro was a big baseball player, and he had an advertisement. And you can find this on YouTube if you want, where he said basically, "I take batting practice. I take Viagra." And there are other football coaches and athletes. So now Viagra was becoming normal. And as a student of medicalization, I became interested in this. So I called two or three of my local HMOs, and I said, "Do you pay for Viagra on that and on your health plans?" And they said, "Depends which health plan." I said, "Okay. Well, what do you pay? And what do you allow?" And one of them said, "We allow 4 pills a month." Another one said, "We allow 6 pills a month." Third one allow 8 pills a month. Well, how do they know what's normal? They're making it up. So it's just interesting. When I'm talking about this kind of the pharmaceutical industry creating norms. I mean, here you have the pharmaceutical industry together with the health insurance industry. And then, of course, you've all seen the more recent Viagra. You don't have to be old anymore. You can be young, and you can come in, the office. Here, come. "Oh, what's new with Ted?" "I don't know. Does he have a new haircut?" "No." "Does he have new clothes?" "No." Does he have, did he get a raise?" "No." "Well, yeah. Very good. I'm a punster, but he got me there. And then across the screen, after the third question is Viagra. And now you see they've changed. They've tried to find drugs for female sexual dysfunction. This whole medicalization of that. There's a great movie, if you've never seen it, called Orgasm Incorporated. I encourage you to see it. But anyway, staying with the men, but making it more of a couples disorder. Then we have Levitra and what's that other one? Cialis, right? And the 2 bathtubs looking over, which looks like could be New Mexico because they're seen for a long way. The tagline is perfect. Cialis is ready when you are. But you can see the medicalization of sexual performance, because now we have not only do we have 60-year-olds who think they can be as vigorous and vibrant as a 25-year-old, when if they just read the literature, at 29 you peak in your testosterone, it goes downhill after that, although nobody knows really what testosterone does related to this. But anyway, the point is, now people take Viagra not because they have sexual dysfunction, because they're worried they might have a sexual dysfunction. So you can just see this. All right, second example, shyness. Shyness used to be a trait that was actually kind of attractive. Oh, she's really, she's sweet, but she's kind of shy. Or, oh, he's a really cool guy. He's just very shy. But now we have a drug for shyness, although you don't know that. You may not know that yet. When Paxil was introduced, Paxil is an SSRI. It went into a very busy and well-populated SSRI market. Prozac, Zoloft, and half a dozen other drugs were already there. So the people who were promoting Paxil said, we need to promote our drug differently. So what they did was they found what was that time a rather obscure diagnosis in the DSM called social anxiety disorder. And they planned on, and you can read this in a book by Christopher Lane called Shyness, chapter 2, I think is the book. It's a brilliant chapter because he actually got the records through a court case from Glaxo about this promotion. It's a brilliant chapter. He's an English professor at Northwestern, but that's what medicalization travels. But anyway, the drug company began to say, well, what we need to do is brand this. This is called condition branding. I only learned this from reading the marketing literature. Condition branding. We have to brand this social anxiety disorder. So they started with, hiring a firm in New York who was going to promote this, the public relations firm. And they started by having bus kiosks with, imagine being allergic to people. And it didn't say much more than that. And it said small letters, social anxiety disorder. And then they started promoting it in magazines, and I believe on some early television, direct-to-consumer advertising. By the way, direct-to-consumer advertising is only legal in the United States and New Zealand. But the genie is out of the box, and there's no way to put the genie back in the box. So we're going to have to live with it. But anyway, they started promoting it in magazines and on television, and they said, do you have trouble at cocktail parties? Hard time meeting new people? Uncomfortable giving talks in public? And there was 2 or 3 other things that I don't remember. See your doctor, because you may have social anxiety disorder. Now, none of these people thought there was anything ever wrong with them. And they looked fairly normal when you see them on the TV. But yeah, I had sweaty armpits, when I was giving talks, and that attractive young woman I wanted to meet, I was kind of unsure that I'd go meet her, Maybe I should take Paxil. But they didn't advertise Paxil. They advertised social anxiety disorder. So maybe I have social anxiety disorder. And then 3 months later, do you suffer from social anxiety disorder? If you do, Paxil. So they created the disorder, made it public, and then gave you the treatment for it. Now, I'm not suggesting, by the way, that nobody benefits from drugs. I throw this caveat in here all the time because some people think I'm anti-drug, and I'm not at all anti-drug. I'm anti what the drug companies do sometimes. But I'll tell you, I had a sister who had 5 major depressions in her life, was suicidal in 2 of them, was hospitalized for all 5 of them, and in between had an excellent life, and thankfully to SSRIs. So, I mean, she had, a lot of benefit from drugs. So I'm not anti-drugs, but I am very skeptical of what some of the drug companies do. Anyway, and so shyness. Now, how much time do I have?
Well,
tell me.
It's 10 to 1.
What time do we end? 1?
What time do we end? 2?
Oh, okay.
I was just reminding you about
I have time anxiety disorder. And
I have interruption disorder.
Oh, I had that too. That's why they thought I was ADHD when I was a kid. Peter, can you sit down and raise your hand? I said, one or the other. I will tell you here, true confessions. I was the kind of kid between 3rd grade and 6th grade. The teacher would say, Peter, could you leave the room so we could continue class? And all I was doing was going back and looking at the goldfish or the encyclopedias in the back or something that was more interesting than going on in class. And I was the kind of person that, if I had something to say, I would sort of blurt it out and my hand would go up later. So this is the last personal anecdote. This is a nice one. In 6th grade, there were 2 of us, two guys in the back of the room, sitting on opposite sides of the room, in my 6th grade class, who were sent out to the hall, the principal's office, spent a lot of time there. It was me and it was Don McLean. Bye, Miss American Pie, that Don McLean. Who he and I have actually gotten together a couple of times and sort of looked at the back of that and said, would anybody think that we'd be here, what we're doing now, back then? Because both of us would have been, this was 1958, both of us would have been diagnosed as ADHD now, I mean, no question. Whether we had ADHD or what ADHD is a whole different set of questions. But, the kind of behaviors we had. My parents, just, Peter, can't you settle down? Can't you behave better? His parents sent him to Catholic school. And he wasn't even Catholic. But he said the nuns, they knew what to do. No ADHD in Catholic school. How many of you went to Catholic school? Am I right? You went? Right. Well, that's a whole other story. We won't medicalize that. The last one, I'm already over time here. The last one I won't say. I've written about human growth hormone and shortness. The little say that what I will say about it is one of the things I'm very interested in now are biomedical enhancements, and I'll say a little bit about it later. But there are very few biomedical enhancements other than cosmetic surgery. What interests me really are the potential of genetic enhancements. There are no genetic enhancements yet to speak of, but there will be. I guaranteed there will be. If it's not your children, it's your children's children. They will be there because we just do a lot of enhancements. The one enhancement I could study was shortness and human growth hormone. I won't go into the details here, but it was an illegal thing done by Genentech because you were allowed to. They developed this artificial human growth hormone in 1985, and you were allowed to use it for people who had growth hormone deficiency, but not for anybody else. It wasn't approved, but the drug companies promoted it well, you know, you got short kids, you can give it to them. And eventually they were sued and had to pay, I don't know, $100 million kind of lawsuit from illegally promoting it. But the notion is that they promoted this drug, and you give it to 6 to 12-year-olds, and you have to give it for 5 years, and you get about 2 inches on the average, and it costs about $10,000 a year. So I thought it was about $50,000 an inch. It might be worth it to somebody or not. But anyway, the whole notion of shortness as a kind of body condition was promoted as an example of that. But what I want to say is about that is that biomedical enhancements, be they cognitive enhancements or body enhancements, is one of the areas where we will see increasingly medicalized by consumers as well as commercialized medicine, by both. Again, it may be a good thing. All right, the third is, the sociologists will be familiar with this. This is my third medicalization of discontents, is the expansion of medical social control. Those are some sociologists who have written about it. David Armstrong in Britain wrote a very nice paper on medical surveillance and the idea of how many parts of our bodies are now under medical surveillance, how many different kinds of measurements people do. And the more measurements people do, the more they're going to find certain measurements on one end, and those will be labeled as risk. And sometimes that's a medicalization of risk. And there's a lot of debates about those things. But that's a slightly different kind of medicalization, but I wanted to mention it here. And then, of course, there are medical social control mechanisms. And I'll just mention 2 cases that I think are interesting. That I have a graduate student doing research on one, and there's been writing on the other. And that is the use of psychoactive medications for what appear to be social control as much as therapeutic treatment. And the 2 cases I mean here, one are geriatric people who are in nursing homes, geriatrics. There are the highest rates of psychoactive drug use without mental health diagnoses in any place are in nursing homes. That is a form of medicalization. It's not medicalization creating the definitions, the diagnoses, but with the use of drugs. And again, maybe it's a good thing. If you work in a nursing home, you might say it's a good thing. I don't want to say that. It just is. And the other one is one that I've just learned about because I have a student doing a PhD dissertation about, is foster care. Foster care has the highest rates of psychoactive medications of any kids anywhere. And it's 4 times higher, 3 to 4 times higher than you'd expect in a normal population. Now the question is, are these kids more disturbed? They've had a lot of bad experiences. Some have to go from foster care to foster care. How much of this is a case mix? I don't know the answer to that. The second question is, how much of this is just social control? It's a way in which to keep the kid in the family. Well, we can medicate them. And the third is, maybe it's just identification. All foster care kids, at least in Massachusetts, get a mental health exam. All kids don't get a mental health exam. So if somebody gives you a mental health exam, some percentage of those kids will be found to have some disorder that can be, in fact, treated with psychoactive medications. My point is only that these are forms of medicalization that don't always fall on the easily listed categories that I came up with earlier. I don't think I have time to talk about medical excuse, but medical excuse goes all the way from parents having to bring in a note for their kids in school. Why Johnny was absent? Oh, he had a cold, he couldn't come in. To Johnny was absent. Oh, yeah, he wanted to stay home. He needed to see his favorite cartoons. Johnny can stay out of school because he's got a cold, but he can't stay out of school to watch cartoons. That's medical excuse is something you can have. I was in the Vietnam War. I was a draft counselor during the Vietnam War. I was actually a conscientious objector eventually. There were lots of people who got doctor's notes to get out of the Vietnam War. There were lots of women in the 60s that got abortions because they got this is before Roe v. Wade, because they got these middle-class women who got 2 letters from doctors that said that they would harm themselves or harm the child if they had to continue the pregnancy. And so they could get then a therapeutic abortion. These are medical excuses. The most extreme of this, of course, is the insanity defense. Somebody doesn't have to go to jail or be executed, or hopefully not, but they're either, depending on the state, guilty by reason of insanity or not guilty by reason of insanity. That's the extreme of that. Sometimes there are funny little stories about that. I went to a state university, and they had compulsory ROTC, Air Force ROTC. I put on my shoes, cleaned them up, put on my uniform, and I marched for the second day of school. I said, this is not for me. So I went to my doctor, this is true story, and I said, I can't do this. And he wrote me a note that I was allergic to wool, and they let me out. Now, if he wrote me a note that I didn't look good in blue, I don't think that would have done it. Even though, so you have to understand the power of medical excuse in our society. And you who take classes, you teach classes, if you miss things and students tell you that it's a medical reason you missed it, it's a different way you look at it than if you say, oh yeah, we just had a party late last night and I just couldn't get up this morning. All right. This is, again, sociologists will understand this one. The clinical view is an individual view. It focuses on the individual. One of the, and rightly so, by the way. If I'm sick, I don't want to talk. Say, oh yeah, right. You're a lower class African American man. No wonder you're dying. Oh, that's very interesting. I don't. Keep your epidemiology to yourself and take care of me. That being said, as a sociologist, I have a different view of this. I can look at the larger scheme of things. So medicalized categories focus on individuals rather than on the social context. Sociology. They obscure the social forces that influence well-being. This is like bringing coals to Newcastle to tell you this kind of stuff. Reinforces technological fixes for social problems. And misses out sometimes on fundamental causes, particularly by focusing on genetics, as opposed to focusing addiction and genetics, focusing on the individual's propensity for addiction rather than the world in which to create somebody who has a propensity for addiction to become addicted. So, and finally, and I'll say only a few words about this because I want to get to the next 2 slides. Consumers in medical markets are becoming more increasingly important in medicalization. There are increasingly amount of things that are consumer-oriented. We all know about various forms of cosmetic surgery and all the kind of biomedical enhancements we have and the way in which they become culturally embedded. You can think of, everything from breast enhancements to, as I was saying, giving one of these talks, somebody said, oh yeah, my brother got pec enhancements. I didn't even know what pecs were, but he did. And you can actually get butt enhancements, it turns out, any part of your body that you need. And of course, we know you can get reductions, equally so. Some parts of the body want to get bigger, some parts want to get smaller. And we have mediated markets and direct markets. Mediated markets is a term that I use when you have to have the insurance companies involved, and you try to get the insurance company to pay for something like that. Direct markets, when you have it yourself. A lot of cosmetic surgery is direct markets. But let's see the other direct market. Oh, infertility is pretty much of a direct market, although some insurance companies are now covering it. But these kinds of things, and some of these are very expensive, but they're becoming an increasingly commercialized form of medicine. And medicine has become commercialized in a number of ways. One interesting example of that is when I first got interested in medicalization in the 1980s, or actually in the 70s, when I was interested in the 1980s, I wanted to do something different, and I thought I was going to do research on bariatric physicians. How many people know what a bariatric physician is here? Just a couple, not many. Bariatric physicians at that time used to be called fat doctors. They dealt with fat people, and they dealt with They did only two things. They did a little management of diet, but mostly they gave people various kinds of pharmaceutical diet pills, and they did surgery, now called gastric bypass, or the other first cousins of gastric bypass. And they were on the edge of medicine. They were almost a stigmatized form of surgeons. You know, if you said you were a bariatric surgeon, first of all, they didn't know what you did. But if they did, they said, "Oh, you do that?" Compared to, you know, all the other wonderful things. But this profession was growing, and I actually thought about doing research on it. I used to get their journals for 2 years to try to keep up and try to think about this. And then I forgot about it for a long time. But then Medicare declared that obesity was a disease, and that, in fact, it could be treated by, in its extreme cases anyway, by by physicians and surgeons and gastric bypass and belts and all of those clips and all those things that you can use. And for some people, they're actually helpful, at least for a certain amount of time. But now, bariatric medicine has moved to the center. After that occurred, hospitals were scrambling to get these formerly stigmatized doctors into their hospitals, or formerly, stigmatized is too strong a word, marginalized. Formerly marginalized, because this would be a cash cow for hospitals. So it's so interesting how all of these things, medicalization isn't simply the change in definition, it's all these things underneath that are interesting as well, and commercialization of medicine as another. Consumers are a very important engine in this. I'll just give you one example of that, adult ADHD. Adult ADHD emerged in the 1990s. Before that, nobody really talked about it. And it emerged in the 1990s in a number of ways, and I'll just give you the simplest way. The simplest way is it began to be two simple ways. One, there was a book called Driven to Distraction that was written, great title, by the way, a book called by Ed Hallowell. And then secondly, there were an increasing number of kids being defined as ADHD by physicians. The numbers were going up. And parents would say, particularly fathers would say, "He has ADHD? I was just like him. No wonder I can't keep my job. I can't keep my desk straight. I don't know. I'm never on time. No wonder I didn't get promoted." And suddenly it became what I call the medicalization of underperformance, of people who didn't feel like they were doing as well as they should. Because I have evidence, when I was doing this research, of people who actually appeared to us very successful, but in fact didn't feel very successful, maybe for psychological reasons, or for otherwise, but who defined themselves as ADHD. And this wasn't the drug. You can't blame the drug companies on this at all, because drug companies weren't allowed to advertise for adults because the drugs were not approved for adults. This was a consumer movement, entirely a consumer movement, that wanted it medicalized. We just did something else.
You're running out of power.
That's not very nice to say. Maybe I need a power drug. All right, I'll just continue. The other thing is, do you know what the medical mantra is of our society? The medical mantra of our society related to this is ask your doctor if fill in the drug is right for you. And at first place, to emphasize the doctors become increasingly the gatekeepers, because it's not follow your doctor what he says to you. It's ask your doctor if it's right for you. And so that's a whole long story in itself, which I don't think I should go into. So we have the changing roles of physicians, from medical imperialism to medical dominance to ask your doctor if it's right for you. So physicians are still involved in terms of legitimation, guidelines, official compendiums, and specialties, sometimes as medical experts, and once in a while as medical entrepreneurs. But basically, they have consumers now. You can read this. If you can't read this, it says, "Patients know more about their diseases than me. I must get a faster modem, higher speed internet access than they have, than them." So I've already mentioned there was points of resistance to medicalization. And I already mentioned demedicalization, so I won't say much more about that. there's a concept in sociology that we used. Don Light was the one who introduced it and developed it about countervailing forces. One of the things about medicalization is there are no countervailing forces. There are people out there who are critics of certain kinds of medicalized behaviors, certain kind of medicalized conditions, but okay. So there are no countervailing forces. So therefore, what we have is, and what I've often said, we have a tidal wave of medicalization over islands of resistance. Some of these you'll know, the GLBT movement and demedicalization. You can see, though, even there's not total agreement. Transgender people disagree, for instance, whether GID should be in the DSM from other people in the LBGT movement. There's disability rights movement. Disability rights movement says disability comes from society. My body is my impairment. Society creates my disability. Again, an attempt to demedicalize. The childbirth movement, you know about. They're small groups of people against ADHD, and all the way from Scientologists to others. They're people, beautiful women of all sizes against the notion of medicalization of obesity and bodies. These are resistance on the internet. I'll skip most of these, but the idea, and some things insurance won't pay for, but these are examples of resistance. But as I say, there are islands in a tidal wave. I'll skip this. And there you have. Anybody recognize the face there? Mike Ditka, Hall of Famer, big Brouillard. He loves his Levitra. This is one of my favorites. Go on the internet and look at anti-aging. That is, if genetics is the one hand of the future medicalization, and second hand is biomedical enhancements, aging is another one. If you really think medicalization is a good thing, invest in aging, because there's more and more of us, and we're going to need more and more things that people are going to. So this was on Business Week, and I thought, could that be more perfect? The anti-aging industry. And again, there's nothing wrong with some of these kinds of things to do, but we're talking about the commercialization of all of these kinds of things and the turning of these things into pathologies. This is the designer Jean Cafe. We'll have 3 eggs, blonde, long legs, an IQ of 160 on the side. In the very near future, certainly you still need prescriptions for many of the pharmaceuticals, but there will be a time in the very near future when pharmaceuticals, which are somewhat already available on the internet, will be easily available on the internet. I am absolutely convinced of that. And I don't mean you'll be able to print them out and just add water and there's your drug, but you'll be able to order them there'll be Land's End catalog on the one side and Body's End on the other side. What I'm interested in now, and I'll answer questions about it later, is the globalization of ADHD. I'm in the process of trying to develop a paper on this. And you can see these are 3 real things from different countries, and this I just couldn't resist leaving off. And this is shameless advertising. And that's it. So can I ask questions? I don't need that. I've already.
Not yet.
Okay.
Because we're going to have a few people make comments.
Oh, okay. Great.
So we're going to have I guess I have to speak into this, is that correct? We're going to have Christopher Lyons and Estelle Vasquez make a few comments. They're going to try to be brief, and then we'll open it up for questions. Okay, so Christopher, you need to come up here because they're filming. That's what I've been told. Sorry.
Thanks for preparing me on that one.
I'm sorry.
I should let Estelle go first because she's a student. I'm sure everybody has a lot of comments here, so I'll keep these very brief. But just to reiterate what Kristen had mentioned before, your work has obviously permeated much beyond medical sociology and the research on even the sociology of knowledge. I'm a criminologist, so I'm not a medical sociologist. I don't really study the sociology of knowledge, but I certainly have benefited from your work, particularly when teaching Deviance. Your work on the social construction of Deviance, the medicalization of Deviance, is really key to understanding the rise of the medical model for how we intervene in and understand the causes of deviance in various ways. So it's been very important for me and my students very much, I think, get a lot from your books and from your work. I've been interested as well in some of the stuff that you've discussed early on in your career about the collusion or collaboration between medical knowledge, the medical authority, and the legal and criminal justice system, and particularly how medical knowledge can both influence how the criminal justice system decides to intervene in certain cases, but also how we use medical intervention to deal with criminals and offenders. There's a lot of research suggesting that these types of interventions can be quite problematic, or can vary dramatically across racial and gender and class lines. Certain individuals can afford to have much more support for various definitions of who they are when it comes to the legal. So I'm curious if you, when thinking about the future and the frontiers of globalization, if you can discuss, maybe talk a little bit about that. I mean, where do you think we're headed with this sort of collaboration between medical knowledge and criminal justice knowledge? And then very generally, you mentioned, I think one of your slides here had this issue of globalization and the future of, or sort of maybe cross-cultural comparisons between medicalization. Insofar as we can quantify medicalization, do we see, to me that's a fascinating area. I mean, I think of, when you think of the consumerization of medicalization, that really strikes me as a capitalist-driven enterprise where, because we're sort of good capitalists, we also kind of want and demand sort of products for dealing with certain things, and the pharma responds. How does that deal with, how does that vary in other countries that are less sort of capitalist in that way? I've been curious about those questions as well. But do you want to come and talk to, and, or should we have individual?
Frank, how do you want this?
I think Peter can respond.
Okay, well, thank you so much for being here, Dr. Conrad. It's been a pleasure to have you here. So I guess I just want to make a few statements as well about, you know, the literature of medicalization and the changes that's been going on in our society, and how sociologists have taken that into writing and talking about the various diseases and how medicine, but also consumers, drive this process, and pharma has an important role. But I think one of my thoughts and statements and kind of questions is, you know, given that we're in New Mexico and we're so racially and ethnically diverse, and a lot of scholars also study Hispanic populations or Native Indian populations, and there's literature about how indigenous knowledge kind of oftentimes conflicts with Western kind of biomedical paradigms or frameworks of medicine. And so I guess one of my thoughts that I've been in my head a lot is like, how does medicalization, I don't know, either challenges or supports or complements or kind of talks about this cross-cultural notion of understanding diseases? Because I know my master's thesis was on how do we even conceptualize the term mental health, and how does that differ among different populations, you know, Latina immigrant or a Native Navajo person. And so really, I guess any insights on how medicalization can speak to the cross-cultural notions of disease is of interest, especially because today you were talking about how medicine or even pharma kind of gives us these problems and then solutions, and even the framing of a disease is very interesting in how pharma plays a role and medical providers play a role, but us consumers do as well. And so all those factors kind of play into cross-cultural things.
Well, I still have my, it would come out double if I gave that out. Good questions. I don't have all the answers for it, but I can make a couple of comments about them. We know relatively little about cross-cultural aspects of medicalization. There have been some studies about very specific things, but not so much about medicalization. We have also people using different frames. I use the term medicalization in the U.S., and some people have used the term biomedicalization. I don't want to get into the distinctions between that at the moment. And in the U.K., people have been interested in medicalization, but have talked also about what they call pharmaceuticalization. And that basically would be the notion that it doesn't necessarily have to have a medical category, but it uses pharmaceutical definitions. So there is some kind of cross-national, but not nearly enough. There are places where I think that medicalization, where we have both over-medicalization and under-medicalization. I mentioned the fact that I've sort of paid attention to ADHD for a long time. In the 1970s and early 80s, there were a lot of people who thought that it was white middle-class teachers putting their middle-class values and definitions on black elementary school kids and defining them as ADHD or hyperactive or whatever and medicating them. Turns out to be not true at all, at least not in any data that I could find. In fact, if anything, it's suburban kids who get over-medicated, and for a variety of reasons we can discuss later. And African-American inner-city kids are, if anything, under-medicated, at least in terms of what people would expect to be the prevalence. Now, the prevalence numbers go up all the time, and usually don't take cross-national or cross-cultural aspects into account. I will tell you one example of medicalization that I didn't talk about here that I think is an interesting one is menopause. Any woman that lives long enough is going to go through menopause. So by my standards, that's normal. But by medical standards, or a lot of medical standards, menopause is something that's been treated as a disease with HRTs, for instance, hormone replacement therapy, which has its own problems, and as we find, that creates more risk than it prevents. The rates have gone down, but still there are still high rates of women treated by menopause. There's an anthropologist named Margaret Locke, who's my favorite medical anthropologist, who's retired but still writing interesting things. Margaret Locke studied menopause in the United States, well, actually in Canada, because she was at McGill, in Canada and in Japan. Turns out in Japan they don't have a name for menopause. It's something that occurs, but it's not seen as the change, the way my mother talked about it. My father said, you have to be nice to your mother. She's going through the change. This is, and I was just a kid. What did I know? They don't have the same definition of that. But the most interesting thing for me was when she asked people in Canada, which is sort of like the United States, what the major symptoms were, they'd be exactly what you thought. They'd be hot flashes, night sweats, and those kind of discomforts. Way down in the list would be sore back or sore neck. In Japan, you ask people what the symptoms are of what they're going through as a cessation of menses. Sore neck, bad back. Hot flashes and night sweats were way down on the list. Here we have the same physiological thing happening to these women, experienced by these women, totally different reports of experience. So when we talk about cross-cultural things, we not only talk about different definitions, but there may in fact be ways in which we hold things that affect how they affect what we do. And obviously in Japan up until probably 1990s, we didn't medicalize, but now the drug companies think, whatever we sell here, we could sell there too. The other cross-cultural thing I can tell you that's interesting, I lived in Indonesia for a year, and that was half a decade or so after I'd finished the epilepsy book, and I got money from World Disability Fund to go interview psychiatrists and neurologists about epilepsy, but I was no longer interested in epilepsy. So I did interview them. I was a good doobie. But I asked them about other things. I asked them about hyperactivity or ADHD, and I asked them about anorexia. All of these doctors, who were all psychiatrists and neurologists, had been trained in US, UK, Holland, or Australia. They were all Western trained. They said, oh, yes, we know about the disorder, anorexia, for instance, but no, we don't have it here. We don't diagnose it here. And the reason they didn't diagnose it there, I thought, and I still think, was that there was a lot of people who in Indonesia were thin. They were just the control of food was not a big issue. In fact, having enough food was an issue. So they did, at least when I was there 25 years ago, they did not have anorexia. By the way, I would bet that they do now, because they didn't have anorexia the same way in Japan than they do now. So but that's a whole another story. So The question is do our Western definitions fit for all these countries? And we know very little about that. So I think that's a really, really good question. And one of the reasons that I'm writing this paper on the globalization of ADHD is I know in the 1990s, ADHD in most of these countries, whatever limited data we have, and it's very limited data, this kind of paper I'm writing, my methodology, I say patchwork quilt. You know, you get a little bit of there, a little bit of there, a little bit of there, trying to make sense out of the story. But in the 1990s, there were very low rates of definition of ADHD outside of North America and Australia. And the rates have gone up all over the world. How did that happen? I won't go into this because that wasn't the question now, but that's an interesting question. The thing about criminology that you ask, or crime and deviance, I wish I had an answer to that. I mean, clearly there are changes in some of the kinds of things that I talked about. The book, Deviance, Medicalization, was a largely historical treatise of trying to understand how things came to be up until that time, 1980, how they came to be medicalized. I mean, I would argue that alcoholism was probably similarly medicalized as it was then, just slightly differently. And some of the other things that people used to in the 80s talk about crime being a brain disease, that sort of has fallen to the wayside. But people still, or XYY, that it's, you know, genetic, all those things have proven not to be true. That being said, I think that we've probably had you might have had, and it'd be interesting, a decrease in medicalization, except for one thing. One thing. This is and that is schizophrenia or serious mental illness. We had deinstitutionalization from mental illness, from mental hospitals in the 1970s and 80s. But we didn't have any cures for, and deinstitutionalization was related to other kinds of problems. But now, the largest number of people with schizophrenia anywhere, do you know where they are? In jail, in prisons. And there was a wonderful article after the Newtown tragedy. It was a wonderful article, at least I thought it was a wonderful article, an op-ed piece by a woman, said, you can Google this, I am Adam Lanza's mother. See, some of you already read this, it's great. And basically, she says that she has a son who's acting out and she can't get him any mental care health treatment. And the only place that she could get him treatment is if he went to prison. So is she going to conspire to get her child go to prison so he can get mental health? So that's a really interesting thing. And I sent that article to 3 of my psychiatrist friends, 2 child psychiatrists, and they said she's absolutely right. She's absolutely right. So I thought that, I mean, that's an interesting way in which crime and has sort of overtaken medicalization. Yeah.
I just want to mention, I really enjoyed that article.
Can we just get the mic? Just so that we've got it on. I'm sure it's a good.
It's not for the room.
Here's Mike, short for Michael. Sorry.
The only difference is that that mother didn't own guns. She recognized she had a mentally disturbed child, and she didn't own guns. So the mother who wrote, you know.
Right.
So
That's all of that is true. I could go into more. What interesting thing today, as I was working out this morning at the hotel, there was a news flash across CNN that let me see if I get it correct. The parents of the guy, was it Loeffner? Yeah, right. The parents of Loeffner were so concerned about him. This is the one who was in the Gabby Giffords shooting. Were so concerned about him that they took his gun. They hid their own guns away. Took his car keys away. This is weeks before this. And here's this kid who parents have already recognized as something is seriously disturbed about this kid, and there was no place to take him. At least that's what they said. So, I mean, talk about crime. And the other thing, of course, that's interesting is if you look at the Newtown, or any of these, Newtown, the one in Aurora, Colorado, or the Gabby Giffords, if If you look at the way the news media talks about it, the news media talks about it as it's bifurcated. It's either guns or mental illness. It's nothing else. Either these guys are mentally ill, so we medicalize them and make sure they don't have guns and give them services. Where are you going to give them services? But give them services, or lock them up. The other because it's not the mental illness, it's not the person, it's the guns. So, I mean, I don't know a lot about crime, and maybe somebody can figure it out, but I think it's really interesting, and there's ways in which medicalization, like that, the way it's people develop their kind of own theories that are, I think, interesting. So can I ask if other people have questions?
Yeah.
I mean, you're the boss, and I'm just
No, we're opening
the hired hand
questions.
here.
We're just asking that people use the mic so that it can be recorded, not that we can't hear each other in the room. Thank you, though.
My question is, in the interest of time, you kind of simply mentioned countervailing powers.
Right.
But could you explain a little bit more your position that they don't exist, and what has changed in the course of the last few decades?
Well, that's a complicated question, but let me give you a simple answer to a complicated question. Countervailing powers, you know, when we talk about them, we have government, drug industry, medical profession, all very powerful, and all looking at issues around healthcare and delivering healthcare, and they focus on that, and they might have different views of that, and within that, each one, there are different political stances, and these are countervailing powers. This is political science kind of terminology that Donald picked. They balance each other out, or they duke it out. Nobody's duking it out with medicalization. I mean, maybe the insurance companies pick things here or there. You know, we'll do that. And maybe there's a group like with gay and lesbian people that pick out their own special issue. Everybody picks out maybe their own, but there's no organization. There's no way in which that somebody is suggesting that there are people in our society that don't have enough health care, and there are people in our society that have way too much health care. And I don't mean they have way too much health care because they're rich and they can afford it, but in fact because so many of the things in their lives have been turned into medical systems. So that's what I mean by there's no organizational countervailing powers. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Howard, old friend, Howard Waitskin.
Hi, Peter. I guess I wanted to first start by thanking you for not only this inspirational talk, but for many years of your work in this field, which have influenced me and many others. I wanted to allude to something I didn't realize about you and your work, which is your role as a conscientious objector and a draft counselor.
Oh, yeah.
Because this is actually a focus that you and I share, and I actually have become more obsessed about this area over time, given our current state of endless war and the way that relates to our failing economic system and the tragedies that that's creating in terms of the epidemic of mental health problems among active duty GIs, one suicide a day now. And I just wanted to ask that maybe you could turn your attention and comment on this sphere of medicalization, because in this era where there isn't a convincing narrative about why we have endless war, what happens is that in our experience on a project with active duty GIs, the majority of GIs going into frontline action now are medicated with psychotropic medications.
That's interesting.
And this seems not only to be a way to deal with the lack of narrative to justify the suffering, but also probably is contributing to the epidemic of suicide because of the interactions and side effects of several of the medications involved. So I think this is a very important area of expanding medicalization. I was wondering if you could comment.
Just take a footnote to that now and make a comment on that. Drugs have been used by various kinds of military for a long time. For Air Force pilots, there was time they gave them amphetamines to stay up, or Provigil. I'm sorry?
Hospice also was the military.
Yeah.
Hospice pilots.
Right. So all of those things have been used. I don't know about, that's what you say is news to me, and it's disturbing. I don't quite know how to answer that. I mean, I think that people use drugs for lots of different things. And here I'm talking about prescription drugs. I'm not saying people who self-medicate, because there are a lot of them. I mean, those of you who drink Red Bull regularly, you know, it's legal, but it's, by the way, don't drink it with alcohol. It's deadly. It's a huge amount of people end up in the emergency department drinking Red Bull with alcohol. But coming back to your point, I just don't know the answer. You know, you probably saw this book. I can't remember the title of it. Comfortably Numb or something like that. But is that the right title? Yeah, Comfortably Numb. Where the argument is that people are given and take a lot of these drugs because our society is so screwed up, and that this is a way in which I don't make this argument. I don't like the argument, but there's probably some truth to that under certain kinds of situations. It makes more things tolerable. We have stories in the Vietnam War that people came back addicted to opiates because they were available and because they self-medicated because the war was so horrible. So I mean, I think that certainly is a use of drugs. Now, if they are in fact prescribed to these soldiers for battle, that's a whole other thing. It probably is not new. I mean, I remember reading things about warriors in various times that would take certain kinds of cocaine, so just chew the leaves, and go into war that way. So that probably isn't new, but that doesn't make it any less disturbing. I do want to say that Howard wrote about some of these issues very early in the 1970s in a book that nobody sees anymore. What's that? Do you remember the title of your book? Illness in Capitalist Society or something like that?
The Exploitation of Illness in Capitalist Society.
Right, The Exploitation of Illness in Capitalist Society. Not a very, very promising title. Not exactly, you know, a book that says, you know, the causes and treatment of childhood pneumonia or something. I mean, The Exploitation of Illness in Capitalist Society. It was an inspiring book when I read it many years ago, and it probably has been out of print forever. But if you have a chance to look at it, you can see Howard in his youth, or read Howard in his youth.
So I'd like to ask both of you whether you think that the medicalization and the use of these kinds of psychotropic drugs, especially in men, at this point, is really due to the failure of the socialization of violence to be enough to force men to go to war.
Could you clarify what you mean by socialization?
So in general, I think males are socialized to be aggressive and more violent than women, right? They're trained to go into battle through sports and other means to fight with each other, and that training previously may have been sufficient to become soldiers. But in the current way we do war, maybe even in the old ways we did war, that socialization may have been enough, and the honors bestowed on males were enough to actually compel them to be fighters, basically. And potentially now, maybe that's not sufficient enough for men in our current society to actually force them to take on this role. Does that make sense?
Well,
So you need to medicate them.
yeah, I actually am skeptical that this was ever sufficient historically, and that the characterization of masculinity as containing attributes to block the experience of dehumanization and inhumane activities. I actually doubt that this applied. What Peter said earlier, in terms of shell shock, this was actually probably peaked in World War I, and now is called PTSD, but very similar. In regard to what really is the dynamic, it's very troubling because it actually applies to women too, because obviously women now are comprising an expanding percentage of combat people.
An
Approaching
expanding percentage of people playing sports.
Yeah, and actually our clients comprise about 25% of women, and these issues about medicalization and overtreatment apply to them too. From my point of view, it's somewhat more helpful to look at it in terms of the social structural causes, in that we currently are living in a period where there's a vast part of the population without opportunities for educational advancement or economic advancement, and so enter the military voluntarily for that reason, and then are suddenly faced with the conditions where medication is necessary to survive.
I just want to add a footnote to that, too. Some of you may have heard on the radio, or NPR, wherever I get my information these days, that this is not unrelated to what you're saying. The incredibly percentage of women in the military that are sexually abused and raped is just extraordinary, higher than almost any other place, including some of the worst places in the United States. There are worse places in South Africa, for example, but somewhat related. That's not unrelated to this in some way that may or may not have anything to do with medicalization. I had one other comment I wanted to make, and then I'll have another question because I think I forgot. Sometimes drugs are created for really good reasons and really good things. Like many of us, and I see there some good gray hairs here, and you have parents with gray hairs, and all of that. There will be a drug, I would predict, in the next few years that will reduce the ravages of Alzheimer's. We probably won't cure it, but it'll reduce the ravages of Alzheimer's. This is an improvement drug to improve people's memory. When that drug comes out, you will see, again, sociologist as predictor here, you will see two things happen. One is, hopefully, that it will be used therapeutically, and secondly, it will be used as an enhancement. And we'll use as an enhancement the same way that now people use things like Adderall and Ritalin. And if I ask any graduate students, and several of them were talking about studying for their comps, how many would like improved memory, you know? All right, there you go, the non-graduate students. Improved memory. Well, we all take that drug, and I predict two things will happen. One will happen, we'll have a new disorder called memory deficit disorder, and there'll be a whole new, and we'll be able to treat that. And second thing that will happen is that people will find out that maybe repression and maybe denial were good things. And that evolution is smarter than the drug companies. I just couldn't not say that. Anybody else? Questions, comments? Yeah. Oh, I'm missing. Oh, I'm sorry. They're bringing you Michael over here.
When you talked about resistance, back to the 1970s and the anti-war movement, there's an issue in relation to acceptance of authority that I think has changed. You look at media, things like Alice's Restaurant and the scene of where the young draftee is yelling, "Kill, kill," in the psychiatrist's office. Or you look at movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or the book, or you look at things like Harold and Maude or the film The King of Hearts, where there was a defiance of authority and where authority was questioned. Can you talk about the relationship between questioning authority and medicalization?
Well, that's an interesting question. There's probably a good connection between questioning authority. If you look at the resistance disability movement, the GLBT movement, even movements that I wouldn't support, like Scientology, they question authority and try to put their... I mean, most of the resistance parts of medicalization that exist, or the Big Bodies Are Beautiful movement, the fat acceptance movement is sometimes called, all of those question authority. They just don't have the same kind of social movements that they do, that they had, with the exception of the GLBT movement. And the disability movement, actually, I shouldn't say that. Disability movement, those are the two largest movements toward questioning medicalization. There are others. I mean, there are other interesting things that I didn't mention. For instance, the most successful health movement in this country, other than probably the AIDS and HIV movement, has been the breast cancer movement. But most of the breast cancer movement has been driven by, and maybe rightfully, trying to help women prevent their individual breast cancers, and has not talked about the environmental causes that we know cause breast cancer. Even the people in the breast cancer movement, the Susan Komens of the world. Susan Komen running for cure, but not running really to prevent. So the kind of lenses that we talk about that see society, and I hate to use that term even as a sociologist because it's so vague, but see aspects of society involved in this. Now there are groups involved in this. Silent Spring is one. There's a local one near us in Boston. But you think about even the way what movements exist, they're much more fragmented. They don't look at it holistically.
So I had a question as well. I was wondering, you said you don't take a position necessarily on medicalization, but I'm wondering about the implications for teaching. And the reason I'm asking is you're aware that now the MCAT is going to require students to learn about the social determinants of health, and clearly this work on medicalization has major importance for the training of the next generation of doctors, but any profession really. Are you aware of the social movement that created that effort to actually include it, and does it include medicalization?
No, it doesn't include a lot of medical sociology, in fact. I've been actually working on a committee at my university trying to figure out, because Brandeis, one of its big constituencies are young students who want to come and get out. We have excellent scientists who want to do the sciences and go on to medical school. And I've been on the pre-med board for 25 years, so I've been involved with some of this. I'd love to have 10 minutes to answer the question, but I don't. So I have a minute, so let me just say this. I think it's great, absolutely great, that the MCAT is signaling students that they should take social sciences, and even most of it's psychology, less of it's sociology, and even less of it's anthropology. But that they should take those courses like they take their biology and biochem courses. I think that is the best message they've given in 25 years. But when I looked at the sample tests that they gave, particularly in sociology, because that's what they asked me to look at, they were good questions, but they were questions you'd find in an intro textbook. They weren't questions about health necessarily. They were questions about human behavior. Now or some about health inequalities, and some of it was okay. It's probably the best part of it is the message it's going to send, I think. That social sciences and behavioral sciences are relevant to healthcare. So, and I don't know how, they've changed already twice since they sent us the first sample packet of questions. So hopefully some of us sent them feedback. So we'll see. But this is, by the way, I should tell you, those of you in sociology, this is an opportunity for sociology to get science-oriented students who wouldn't normally take a sociology course to take a sociology course, even if it's an intro course, or to take a medical sociology course because they think that maybe they'll learn something there too, and bring that into their consciousness. I think, and I mean, I've told this to my department, I think it's a great opportunity for us. I don't know what the results will be. Questions, comments? I think I had one more. Oh yeah, I had one more I was going to say. Another old friend.
Yeah, yeah, we've known, it's been a long time.
Friend.
Yeah. I recently got on a listserv called the People's Pharmacy.
Oh yeah, I've heard that.
And that's interesting because it does seem to be a bit radical. For example, the question, you don't really need to take statins. There's nothing inherently wrong with having so-called high cholesterol unless it's related to unless you've got heart disease. And you know, and this sort of thing. So I think it is a bit of resistance against medicalization of some things.
Yeah, there is, and although that came out of American Journal of Cardiology, right. They were the ones who first said you don't have to take statins. But then it came out later that a second study published in New England Journal of Medicine that people who lived that even though it didn't seem to reduce heart disease, it seemed to have something to do with other things related to longevity. So if you're on statins, you may as well take them anyway.
Yeah, right.
I did want to mention one other. I keep thinking of these other things because obviously you're a very stimulating audience. In 1971, a very well-known psychiatrist, I think he was, named Gerald Clarman, talked about one of the problems, and he wrote this in JHSB, Journal of Health and Social Behavior, so not that many psychiatrists, that's a psychiatrist or internist, didn't matter. But he had a concept called pharmaceutical Calvinism. that people in the United States would rather do it by themselves than take drugs. Ain't that way anymore. Whatever the opposite of pharmaceutical Calvinism is, now some people still hold those, but overall in the culture, that's changed. And so people are much more likely to be comfortable taking drugs, particularly ones that have a lot of cultural meaning, like Prozac. I remember when I gave this talk once, somebody raised their hand in the back of the room and said, I have a little anecdote for you. I have just two friends, two women friends of mine, both of whom are just getting divorced. And both of them had the same experience with their GP, not a psychiatrist, their GP. And went in and told them he was getting divorced. GP said, should I start you on Prozac? No diagnosis, nothing else. Just should I start you on Prozac? That's how common it's been. And whether or not people will, in fact, do that or not, it's no longer pharmaceutical Calvinism. I'm done.
We're going to end this, but I'd like everyone to join me in thanking Peter. And thank you, Peter.